Hello, I'm Susie Miller, Executive Director for the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. Welcome to the second of 3 industry expert panels on challenges and opportunities to demonstrating the sustainable production of Canadian grains. Comprised of farmers, input providers, marketers, customer, and environmental organizations, the CRSC is a national industry-led forum developing and showcasing Canada's grain sustainability performance. In this session, we will hear from Wade Subkovich from the Western Grain Elevator Association and Michael Aramowicz from Aramark Foods. This panel was recorded from a meeting on January 28th, 2022, between the CRSC and grain crop associations in Canada. I would like now to turn over the session to our moderator, Kelly Green. Kelly is the chair of the CRSC Communications Committee and Director of Communications at the Canadian Canola Growers Association.
We have 2 guests that have joined us today who are going to speak about their experiences with their organizations in terms of sustainability. The session is going to start with a brief set of introductory comments from our guest speakers. We're then going to move into a short moderated session of questions, and then we will open the floor to questions. We have until 1:25 Central, so we will do our best to work through this and open the floor for a few questions at the end. If at the end we don't get to everyone's questions, we will make sure we capture those and get some responses to that as well. And we're going to follow the same process. If you have questions for later on, please raise your hand or post them in the chat. So I want to welcome our two guests for this next session. We have Michael Aramowicz with Aramark, and we have Wade Subkovich with Western Grain Elevator Association. Thank you for joining us, both of you, today. We're going to start with Michael. Michael is the Director of Sustainability at Aramark, and he's going to tell us a little bit about who Aramark is, because I'm sure some of us probably don't know. We've probably come in contact with Aramark, but we maybe don't know it. Michael's been with the organization since 2008, and while he started in more of a finance role, he's moved into the areas surrounding environment and sustainability issues in regard to the company and its overall approach to sustainability throughout the organization. His role was actually created to establish sustainability as a permanent part of Aramark's supply chain and strategic planning. And I'm going to pass the microphone over to you, Michael. Thank you once again. Michael has joined us in a couple sessions, so we really appreciate you joining us again today. Over to you.
No problem. And thank you, Kelly. Thank you to all of you for having me today. What Kelly says about Aramark is true. We are one of those companies that, one of those big, enormous companies that no one's ever heard of. We operate primarily in institutional managed services, which 99% of the time involves food. So often public institutions, universities and colleges, hospitals, also private. We're in a lot of dining facilities for companies like banks and insurance companies and the cable companies and all of those guys. A big part of our business is in what we call our remote services sector, which are, mining, oil sands camps, that kind of thing in parts of the country where a lot of the type of services, particularly food, that we provide are sometimes difficult to maintain locally. And more and more we're seeing sustainability, local food, certifications, that kind of thing, become more of a priority for our clients, certainly in an effort to help meet the growing demand for that type of thing amongst our consumer or our customer base and consumer land in general. So, lots of hopefully I'll be able to add a little bit of context, perspective to the questions that you all have, and for what you're discussing today. I've been in my role connected with sustainability for about a decade now, and I've seen a tremendous amount of evolution and change in that time, particularly with respect to the level of knowledge that consumers have when it comes to these topics. When if I use because we're in the public domain, often a lot of our business is contractually based. We get a lot of RFPs from the public sector, and when using that as a kind of a barometer or a benchmark for the level of knowledge out there when it comes to sustainability and the items in a food context, I should say. It's night and day. The kind of questions we used to see in the RFPs we would receive would be very, very basic. Just reference things like, we want to see more local food, without defining what that means. We want to see more sustainable food, same kind of thing. And now when we look at what the kinds of questions and the type of asks that we get in those RFPs, they're very, very specific. And the way that those elements are scored and rated towards who the successful proponent is going to be is much higher than it ever was. So hopefully being part of that evolution over the last decade and seeing how that's changed amongst consumers, I'll be able to add a little bit of perspective today. So thanks again for having me.
Thanks so much, Michael. That final comment you made does align a little bit similarly to some comments Dean made in the first half of our session. So I'm sure we'll have some more conversation about that. We're now going to have opening comments from our second guest, Wade Sobkwich, with the Western Grain Elevator Association. Many of you on today's call will probably be familiar with Wade, as he is executive director of WGEA. He's been in that role since 2004, though he did join WGEA in 1997. And prior to that, he worked in economic development in rural communities in Manitoba. Wade is a graduate of Assiniboine Community College as well as University of Manitoba. And he grew up on a cattle farm near Fisher Branch, Manitoba, which is in Manitoba's Interlake. And Wade lives in Winnipeg, similar to me, and with his family. So Wade, thanks for joining us today, and welcome. And we look forward to hearing your opening comments.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks everyone for having me on. I really enjoyed listening to the discussion here earlier, and so I've been asked to provide some comments on behalf of the grain companies on the relevance of sustainability to end-use customers. And so here I go, and I have some prepared comments, so I'm going to go through those, and then happy to take any follow-up questions. But so I've, in preparing these comments, this isn't just coming from me, I've gone through a pretty detailed process with all of the grain handlers and exporters, and to get a set of comments prepared that really reflects what they're seeing and sort of what the approach is going to be from their perspective going forward. And just to be clear, this isn't sustainability, and proving sustainability or demonstrating sustainability isn't something the grain companies want to do. They're not driving this at all. They're responding to their customers' demands, and so I guess I just want you to keep that in mind, that when you're thinking about, well, what is the grain company going to require of me? It's really being required because it's being required of them, and they need to be able to demonstrate it. So they are seeing global demand growing for information about how Canadian crops meet sustainability standards, and they're seeing retail and food service using it as both a tool for market advantage and to avoid consumer scrutiny. And so in the near future, they expect it to become a requirement in all developed country markets and a growing number of developing economies as well. And this is both international and domestic markets. We're seeing the concern about environmental and social consequences of farming translated to questions about the use of pesticides, fertilizers, GMOs, carbon impacts, food waste, how it's grown, how it's handled, water usage, deforestation, preservation of grasslands, reduction of greenhouse gases, etc. So there's a whole array of questions companies are being required to answer by certain customers, and those consumers are increasingly of the view that there isn't enough transparency about food production or standards in agriculture. So that's been their experience over the last few years. And then at the same time, regulators and governments are expanding their focus on incorporating sustainability into investment information on policy making. So on the grain side, this is coming mostly from Europe, but it's coming from the US, and it's coming from certain Asian markets, and it's coming domestically here at home. And next, we expect to see more requirements out of Asia, and then from the stronger Middle Eastern economies. And we expect Africa and South America to remain, though they're probably not going to require this in the short term. In the foreseeable future, they're going to remain a commodity market. So internally to Canada, if we can't demonstrate how grain is sustainably produced, and in fact that it's contributing to greenhouse gas reduction, we expect government to come with their own conclusions and to develop a policy that we may not like. So, and then in addition to that, there's a need to manage technical barriers to trade and non-tariff trade barriers. And if we can't document and demonstrate sustainability, then it becomes another lever available to countries of import to deny imports when political or market conditions make it desirable to do so. We've seen that in the recent past with China when they want to lock out Canadian imports, they pick a reason, and this gives them another reason. So, and we've also seen this on durum to Italy, and we are not going to be surprised to see it again. So we want to preemptively try and remove that as a technical barrier. And so in terms of specifics, the requirements that companies are being asked to meet fall into four main buckets. So companies are being asked to demonstrate health and safety, so they already have to fill out information on employees' wages and breaks and the ability to form unions, etc. And then the second basket is the environment. They're being asked for sustainability plans. Do they have plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, protect biodiversity, responsible use of chemicals, etc. The third basket has to do with ethics and human resources, procurement plans, anti-corruption, anti-slavery, business ethics, human rights, child labor. Like we don't enslave anybody, and we don't have child labor, but we're still required to tell that to our customers. And then the last one is food and feed safety. And then so that one is a requirement for which there's no premium. Customers and consumers won't pay a premium for safe food. They expect the food to be safe, and the sustainability requirements seem to be falling into that same category, where they're not going to pay to know that the food is sustainably produced. They just expect that it's going to be sustainably produced. So in response to satisfy these demands, we've seen Argentina, Australia, Brazil, and the UK and the US, they already have sustainability programs in place, and we're worried we're already losing market advantage to these countries. And then, except for a handful of niche sales opportunities that typically carry extremely detailed sustainability requirements handled through closed loop production contracts, there isn't a premium for demonstrating sustainability. It has become, and it will become more and more the minimum offering that's acceptable to compete in the marketplace. So exporters would see value in a plan that does three main things. Number one, develops a standard common approach. Number two, builds trust in the eyes of others by making voluntary commitments. And number 3, avoids burdensome regulation or legislation. And we've done this in the past in the grain industry, where we can see that there's potentially a regulation coming down the pipe, and we've developed the code of practice. An example is confined space entry. The grain elevators have a code of practice on confined space entry, and they did this to avoid burdensome regulation. Government typically looks on codes of practice favorably and as an option or as an alternative to legislation. So this is particularly relevant because in the last year alone, the government has made commitments to reduce fertilizer use, pesticide use, destruction of natural habitats, and dramatically reduce greenhouse gases. So in time and in not very much time, any supplier or exporter that cannot demonstrate sustainability runs the risk of becoming a supplier of last resort to markets where sustainability is important, and they'll have to shift to lower premium markets. But due to our cost structure and the distance to tidewater, Canada doesn't compete well into lower premium, lower quality markets. Canada does well into markets that pay a premium. And so therefore, grain exporters are going to do everything in their power to maintain those markets. And this may mean an outcome where producers will have to demonstrate things differently to different grain handlers in accordance with their individual programs and systems and contracts. In Brazil, for example, they have 13 or 14 programs. And as Canadian handlers, we prefer to avoid a situation where 5 years down the road, we're being criticized for a cumbersome system that doesn't treat producers equitably. And we've heard that on other files before, that producers want to be treated equitably. And so something's going to fill this space. So I guess the question you might be asking yourselves is, why are we doing this now? Why don't we wait until the demand is clear and present before we pivot? And the answer is because today Canada is mostly trusted. And we're seen as a reliable supplier for the most part of quality grains, and we want to maintain that status. But if we lose it, we fear it's going to be difficult to recover. It becomes less important to be specific on the details when you're starting from a point of trust. Ironically, when you're starting from a point of not being trusted, the details also don't matter because they just don't trust you. So we enjoy a position of trust right now, and therefore we think we can get through this with minimal disruption because we won't have to be as liberal with the details as we would otherwise if we wait too long. And then again, last few points is that, you know, we as exporters, we've come to learn that the customer is always right, even when they're wrong. And the consumer is the customer of the restaurant, which is the customer of the baker, which is the customer of the miller, which is the customer of the grain company, which is the customer of the producer. And what's being proposed is that producers proactively take control over how we demonstrate sustainability. And we have the opportunity to control the narrative and maintain trust and maintain markets. And if we wait, it could become very rigid and time consuming and complex and duplicative. And there will be individual requirements where both farmers and grain companies alike will have winners and losers. And if we go this route, then we fear the efficiency of the system and Canada's brand will suffer. So, you know, we really think now is the time to try and get in front of this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wade. Some interesting points that I'm sure we'll have some questions about. You referenced some topics like market advantage and a position of trust in Canada's grain industry. So I think there's some interesting points. And right now we're going to move into a bit of Q&A with Wade and Michael. And in a couple questions, I'll just open the opportunity for you to ask questions as well. But I do want to start with a couple of questions, and I'm going to ask this question of both of our panelists today. And I think this touches on something both Michael and Wade talked about. And the white paper that each of you have seen, it addresses a number of opportunity areas for Canada's grains and oilseeds to respond to changing sustainability demands. And I was wondering if you could speak to which of the opportunity areas in the white paper do you see impacting your organization or the industry most. The areas that were identified include market demand, public trust, ESG and investor needs, regulation, and there may be other ones. So I'm going to start with Michael and then move on to Wade. Could you talk a bit about Aramark and which of those you see being the most significant areas for your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the two that come to mind most quickly are our public trust and ESG. I'm not. Wade spoke so well to the public trust point. I'm not sure how much I could add to that. We know it's something that can turn on a dime, even in in periods of that we enjoy relatively high public trust in the world market. But with ESG, this is something that more recently we're really starting to see within our organization. And I think a lot of consumer-facing, sort of middle of the supply chain companies are starting to really feel. And when we talk about ESG, at least what I talk about, the first thing that really comes to my mind is reporting, public reporting, shareholder reporting, that kind of thing. We used to be able to talk about our sustainability approach and our programming very much in terms of a narrative. We would talk about the different sorts of initiatives that are happening, whether behind the scenes or in the field, consumer-facing activities that we do. But more and more, what we're needing to do is take that information and transfer it into a format that is something a little bit more akin to almost like a financial report. There are a lot of different frameworks that exist right now, like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, Global Reporting Initiative, things like that, where it's becoming more and more important to take those initiatives, those narratives that I talked about, and make them more quantifiable, put them into something that's a little bit more easily comparable for people who are not as well versed in what's happening in terms of actual action items for sustainability or things. Most consumers don't really have the first idea of what's happening. Well, certainly on a farm, you all know that, and just the same as it is behind the scenes in our business, which is consumer facing. It doesn't have to be that far away for it to be behind a kind of an impenetrable curtain. And so what we're trying to do is figure out ways to quantify, provide more kind of touch points for the people, whether they're just trying to choose the brand, or whether they are, an investor or something like that. They need to be able to have something that they can understand that's comparative. And so we're trying to put together the infrastructure within our organization to be able to feed into those frameworks, to have those quantifiables and those kinds of metrics that we can put in there. And from there, it's a lot easier for the consumer or the investor or what have you to be able to make those kinds of assessments. If we don't have those, it's a lot easier for them to just leap to the conclusion that we're not really doing anything at all, and choose somebody else, in the marketplace that does have those kinds of metrics. It's about that transparency and accountability, and they will assume that if we don't have that, and we can't share those kinds of documents or those kinds of metrics with them, that we're actually not doing anything at all, and that a lot of our narrative is really just fluffy corporate speak or greenwashing. So yeah, I think that if long way of saying, if I had to pick one of those really that we talk about within the white paper, it would be the ESG, specifically on the reporting piece.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Yeah,
Wade, could you dive in? Thanks.
Well, Michael answered that question so beautifully. I don't have much to add other than to say that, market demand is pretty important, a pretty important piece, because we're not consumer-facing organizations. All we know is that our customers are looking for that because they need to satisfy certain requirements. So, public trust is important. It's our customers that are responding directly to those concerns, and we're helping them do that. So in order to make the sale, in order to execute on the transaction and satisfy the requirements of the transaction, that you need to demonstrate in some way that you've met those requirements so that they can take that forward and demonstrate it to the next part of the supply chain. So, market demand, I think, is probably an important one.
Thanks very much, Wade. We're going to move on to another question, and we're going to start with Wade. I'm not sure, Michael, if you would have comments on this one or not. And the question is, is Canada's grain supply chain positioned to respond to the forces and changing trends that both you and Michael have talked about, but it's also in the white paper. And one of the things curious for you to speak on a bit is, because the grain system in Canada is largely a bulk handling system, how does that come into context when we think about sustainability? So Wade, could you take that one, please?
Sure. Yeah, that is true, that we have a bulk handling system, and we do segregate grain. I mean, we have, there are multiple segregations within a facility. And we think that, a bulk handling system does present some challenges in keeping everything segregated. But if you're IPing certain things away from the bulk handling, the mainstream bulk handling product, it's easier. If you have to IP everything throughout your system, it's very costly and becomes very inefficient. So there are things that companies can do, and they're going to have to look at more and more ways to keep products segregated as things evolve. But we think we're as positioned as well as any other of our competing countries in order to keep it segregated. There have been a lot of investments made in new technology and new facilities and state-of-the-art equipment and capacity that we're built to overcapacity from technically when you run the numbers. So that gives us some a better ability to segregate. So that the elevator system itself is doing okay. We think we're reasonably well positioned in spite of the fact that we're a bulk handling system. There may be some changes required down the road. A notable caveat is rail service, and that's damaged our reputation in the past as our inability to supply product in a timely way at certain times, at certain events that have happened over the last decade or so. But we're working on that file too to try and get improvements on rail service. So yeah, I mean, that's not really a very clear answer, but I think that's what we would say about it. And if we don't, and we're not well positioned, and we're unable to adapt, then shame on us for not taking into account the needs of our customers and being able to deliver on that.
I'm going to just bring forward a question that Wade actually addressed a bit in terms of his presentation and his opening comments. And this is actually a question that carried through from a session we had earlier. And so we had said we'd ask this question at the next session. And it has, and Michael, this one was directed specifically to you, but the question was about, if you could address, from someone who is a consumer-facing market, if you could address the opportunity for, is given the sustainability asks that some consumers have, is there a way that can be met with any opportunity for value being transferred back to the farm, or asking consumers to pay more for that? And so that was the context of the question that was asked at the last session. So yeah, what's your experience with consumers when they're asking for these?
I will say it's a really interesting question and a really interesting idea. I do think there is an opportunity there. Our own market research has showed that little by little, year over year, there are a growing number of consumers that are willing to pay a little bit more for something that they consider to be produced sustainably, right? And I'm going to separate that from the idea of just overall quality, because we already, I think everybody would agree that, you know, something is perceived to be of higher quality overall, that, you know, that a higher value can be placed on that, a higher, you know, at a higher price. I would suggest that sustainability adds more and more to the overall perceived value of that product. They're not mutually exclusive, right? Sustainability can be perceived as adding value to a product. So, you know, if there are ways of putting a kind of adding value, adding some kind of a premium to it, it would really depend on the way that you would go about that. I mean, if you were to take a product like we've seen with, I'll use an example of fair trade, for example. So different commodities, certainly different parts of the world where things of fair trade products typically are being grown, things like coffee, tea, cocoa. There are some standards and certifications out there that very clearly and transparently rely on the idea of having a premium, a quantifiable premium that is placed upon the on that product. You know, there may be, as in the case of fair trade, there may often actually be a minimum price that's established for the commodity itself, and there are consumers who understand that and are willing to pay it. I think it really depends on, a lot of it depends on the overall story and the context by which that premium is set. So if you were to take something that where the idea of the value, say, was the fact that it was local, that might be a little bit more difficult, because to me, from what I understand of the kind of demand we get for local products, there's this perception that still exists that if it's local, it should be cheaper. We know that not to be the case, but a lot of consumers just feel that way. They think that they have this impression that if it's traveling not as far, that, you know, somehow it should be cheaper. So that would be more difficult to just kind of say, hey, well, look, it's Canadian, it's grown locally, you know, it's grown to a higher standard. Here you go. Here's the premium that you're going to pay. Not to say it's impossible, but it's difficult to be able to tell that whole story and to provide the consumer with that context, to be able to say, to prove to them, to clearly show them that it is grown with at a higher standard. It is more of a quality product because it's Canadian. We don't always get that opportunity to easily deliver that kind of a message. So I would say that there is probably an appetite and an opportunity to add a premium, but you'd have to be very careful about the way that that was communicated. I think something like a code of practice, something that is almost akin to a kind of a certification like we see in other world commodities, may actually be the right way to go, because it is a quick touch point. It's an identifiable thing that over a little bit of time, consumers can start to attach a perceived value towards. I hope that answers the question, but I think there, as the short answer is yes, I do think there is an opportunity for there. The longer one is, as long as we really make sure that we establish the proper context around what that premium represents. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks so much, Michael. We have 10 minutes left, so I will invite you to ask questions. I do, if we have time, want to ask both Wade and Michael a question about sharing information along the supply chain. But first of all, let's go to some questions. Chuck, I believe you had your hand up first, so please ask your question.
Hey, thank you, Kelly. Just wondering, Wade, can you foresee, like, if we don't go forward with a code of practice of some kind, that grain companies may want us to sign declarations stating that we are producing grain following sustainable practices or whatever the case might be, and our grain might end up being segregated. Not so, and I don't think we really see premiums for doing this, but I can see discounts for farmers who don't follow sustainable practices, or maybe having more limited marketing opportunities. So just a comment, and I'd like to hear your response.
Yeah, I think that that's probably right. Like I think the way you're going to see, like, it's not a direct line premium, but there is added value for sustainability. So let's use canola, for example. And when Viterra and Richardson's got locked out of the Chinese market, and so we thought we were going to be sitting on canola stocks and the price was going to go down, right? But Viterra and Richardson's, they were able to get, was it, I forget what you call it, but there was the EU Energy Directive. So they were able to, they selected producers and they were able to get them certified to be able to show good record keeping on chemicals and storage and harvest details. So then they were able to enter that European market with canola. So we didn't end up with that 4.5 million tons of added stock in the country that we thought we were going to, and we didn't see canola prices come down like they otherwise would have. So, I mean, would you call that a premium for having a sustainability program on canola? It's not a straight line, but it did help elevate values. And so, yeah, I do think that without a broad program, there's going to be too much pressure on grain companies over time and not too much time to be able to demonstrate something. And if they don't have a program like this that they can point to, then they're going to have to come up with something on their own in a competitive marketplace, right? So then they may add something to their producer declaration or to their contract or something, so that a farmer is demonstrating that they're producing that grain in a certain way. So the grain company can therefore demonstrate to their customer in Europe or the United States or even domestically here that it's met the criteria. And so that's where we're worried you may end up with some deviating programs on a grain company specific basis, depending on where they're exporting into and what sort of needs they need to satisfy. So I think it's both untrue to say that there is a premium, and it's both untrue to say that, and it's also untrue to say there isn't a premium. It's like when you're selling your house and you have one buyer versus selling your house and you have 75 buyers.
Thanks so much, Wade. Chuck, I think Wade touched on the points that you had raised, so thank you very much. We'll go to Bill, and then Susie, if we have questions in the chat next, I'll go to you next for questions in the chat. So Bill, could you ask your question?
Thanks. I wanted to pursue Kelly's question a little further about how sustainability in general can function with a bulk handling system that's been the backbone of our grain economy. And I guess to Michael, I'd ask how do you function now when if you're buying flour, for example, for your operations, the wheat in that flour has come from hundreds of different farmers. I've seen statistics on beef that the average hamburger has meat from 300 different animals. If customers are making demands, how do you meet them within a bulk handling system? And if you start chasing small quantities just to meet particular criteria, what does that do to your own Scope 1 emissions in terms of increased transportation, storage, handling, and whatsoever? And I guess if Wade wanted to chip in, if our grain handling system has to adopt to this kind of a market supply situation, again, how does that affect your Scope 1 emissions if rather than an efficient bulk handling system moved by rail is suddenly small cargoes moved by truck all over the place that in the end are still essentially delivering the same products? Thanks.
Sure, I can start. Let's see. Well, first, just to answer the point about the scope one, we're in a little bit of a unique situation because we are the way that our business operates most of the time, almost all of the time, is as a guest in somebody else's house. We are we work on, typically speaking, particularly in the public sector, on contracts that are like 5 to 10 years. We don't have a lot of our own bricks and mortar. In Canada, we don't even have a very large fleet. We go into an existing facility, we operate with their equipment. Mostly we manage the staff and we do the purchasing for them. So when we look, in order to do things from that aspect of sustainability, when we're looking to sort of lower our footprint, so to speak, we very much look down the supply chain. I mean, we're at the end of the supply chain. So we look very much towards the middle of it, and we look for help from those from our suppliers, more kind of in the middle of it. And we so we in a lot of ways we have to kind of leverage their sustainability stories, and we push them with the purchasing power that we have in order to try to become more sustainable themselves as part of our own RFP process and everything else. So that's one aspect. The other part of your question, I think, having to do with things that are, commodities that are bulk handled, we've seen a little bit about that. In my experience, one of the ways that I think, and this may help, it goes back to what I was talking about with ESG. The more quantifiable we can get, the better. And so one area, for example, where we've had to work with, this is within the egg industry. We've been very much forced by consumers, by our clients, by activists, by everybody, it seems, to make certain commitments in the egg world having to do with animal welfare. So cage-free or free run or whatever. The way that we've had to within those commitments be able to report on progress along the way. And one of the ways that we're having to do that, we're sort of being forced to do it, is to find where there are measurable, from a certain supplier, where there are measurable mix of supply that's coming either from a cage-free source versus a conventional source. So the higher over time, the higher the level of the cage-free source within that, like let's say it's a liquid egg product, then we're able to say that we're making progress because we started off at say 20%, and over time, because of the pressure that's been put onto the supplier to source more from cage-free for the raw ingredient, we're starting to see it. We can now say it's maybe 50% or 60%. I'm making these numbers up, but just to give you an idea of what I mean. And that is something that will probably start to be considered a little bit more. And the demand for tracking that all the way through the supply chain is going to come along with that as well. So if you have something to be able to say that we've produced this according to a certain set of standards, i.e. a code or something like that, it gives the middle of the supply chain folks the opportunity to say, okay, we know that this percentage of the bulk ingredient came being prepared in a certain way, and Y percentage wasn't. So hopefully that helps a little bit. We're still a long way, I know, throughout the supply chain to be able to measure it to that degree, right down to the individual farm. But that is kind of the way that we see things going with other commodities already, and it's possible that that could start to happen in the grain world as well.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's interesting to have that perspective on this question from an organization who's, front-facing with the consumer. Wade, I don't know if you would have just 30 seconds to touch on this. We're almost out of time, and I do want to at least get one question out of the chat. So,
sure, just maybe a brief comment on part of it. I think part of the question was, how can the supply chain handle this, and how can the bulk handling system handle this? So I think the way it would evolve, and this is just me talking, I don't know for sure, but I think the way it would evolve is grain companies would begin by IPing this grain through the system, and incurring costs for doing that. in order to access certain markets as the requirement emerges, and then only get those producers for that grain to identify that they've followed certain thresholds of sustainability. But as it becomes more and more commonplace for this requirement to be there, you know, as I said earlier, you can't IP everything. So then it all just becomes part of the bulk handling system, and then it just becomes a requirement because they're unable to keep every single thing segregated. So you know, it would evolve into a commonplace requirement in the system at some point down the road. I guess the question is sort of how long, but that's kind of the way I see it taking hold in the grain handling system.
Thanks, Wade. Susie, is there one question in the chat we could bring up?
Yeah, well, it's sort of a series of questions. It's by Wade Gray, and basically his question is around a less quality product for a higher that a consumer will buy a less quality product as long as it's been produced sustainably over a higher quality product. And he gives an example like number 4 Durham sells for a higher price than number 1 if it can be proven to have been grown sustainably.
I guess that would be a factor of the marketplace, but I don't think it would happen that way as coming from a single country. What would happen is if somebody wanted a number 4 produced sustainably, they would go to a country that can produce it sustainably. So they would go and get that from Australia or somebody else, because if Canada can't demonstrate it, then they're not going to even entertain a sale. So you know, how the price comes out on a number 4 out of Australia versus a number 1 to a different market that doesn't require sustainability from Canada, it's really hard to tell, you know, what would be higher and what would be lower. There are too many variables in order to answer that.
And I would actually say it goes back to kind of the earlier point I was trying to make about how, you know, quality and sustainability are not mutually exclusive. So you know, what we're seeing really is that more and more sustainability is starting to be associated with the overall quality of the product. So I mean, I think that and you know, it could be argued depending on the product, depending on the commodity, how much value the consumer attaches sustainability to the overall value. But I think overall, with food products in general, what we're seeing is just a trend, and that trend is that it's growing, that consumers are starting to see, you know, so it's not necessarily a number 4 that is grown unsustainably or grown sustainably versus a number 1 that isn't. There's a lot of room in between there, and I think potentially consumers are going to start to move towards, if you've, instead of that, do a comparison between, say, 2 number 1s, one's sustainable and the other one isn't. What we're going to see is a shift maybe more towards the number 1 that's grown sustainably, and as that trend continues in the direction that we're seeing it now, that might even start to apply even to lesser quality or number 2s or whatever, what have you. So if I understand the question correctly, then that's what I would say, is that don't discount sustainability from the overall value or quality, I should say, of the product.
Thank you for viewing our panel session. Should you have any comments or questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. You may also want to view our metrics platform, which provides information on the sustainability performance of Canadian cereals, oilseeds, and special crops. You can find the metrics platform at metrics.sustainablecrops.ca.